Hi, I'm Ryan West and we're at Dungeon Beach in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And I want to share with you a couple of tips on how I deal with drums in a live drum session. These drums that we're about to hear are live drums that I recorded in a session a few months ago. It's just a stereo pair of microphones spaced over the kit, equidistant from the snare so that I didn't run into any phase problems with the snare. So, we want to keep that, you guys know how that works, right? Same distance from the snare for both mics. You measure it with a measuring tape. We get all nerdy about it. At least I do. In any case, so these are just the raw drums. This is just microphones through a preamp, straight into Pro Tools, no trickery involved. That was recorded in kind of a small room, so we don't hear a whole lot of the room. It's not very big and expansive sounding. One of the first things I like to do is maybe pull a little bit of the low end out of the overhead signal, because later on I'm going to be adding in the direct microphones from the kick drum and the snare drum, and those are going to provide the heft and the weight and the beef. What I really want to do with the overheads is just make it sort of sound very natural, neutral, and then I'm going to control the dynamics with the compressor. I'm going to go ahead and grab a Trident EQ and just reduce the low end a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and use the high pass filter, and I'll probably set it to 100 Hertz to start off with. I'm going to play it a couple bars and then I'll pop the filter in and we'll make a decision of whether that's really working for us or not. Check it out. Pretty much what I was going for, so I don't really have to make any big changes here. This EQ is pretty cool because it has a saturation knob on it. You can actually drive the input side of this EQ a little bit and get a little saturation on it. Sometimes I think that can work really, really well for drums, certainly with the kick and snare, but I'm going to try it here on the overheads. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Let's see what it sounds like. It's always fun to play with, right? I like what it's doing. I had to actually push the tracks a little bit harder into the overhead bus just to get it to saturate a little bit just as we were listening, so that's why you heard the volume change. I'm just getting a little bit of saturation when the biggest snare drums hit. I think it works for this, so I'm going to leave it for right now. The next thing I want to do is I want to put up a compressor where I have control over the attack and release of the compression. A great compressor for that? Guess what? It's our FET compressor. I like this one on drums because it gives me all the kind of controls that I need in order to make the drums move in the way that I want to. And namely, that's attack and release. And in this particular plugin, it's got a low cut for the detector circuit. We've described this in other videos, but what it really does is anything that is below the frequency that you set this detector circuit at is not going to trigger the threshold of the compressor. So basically, the compressor is not reacting to anything below the frequency we set this at. Since we did pull out a lot of the low end, I don't think we're going to need it too much, but I'm going to go ahead and set it around 200 anyway. I just don't want this compressor pumping on any of the low frequency stuff. So generally for drum overheads and this kind of stuff, I'm using about a 4:1 or 6:1 ratio. I want to get a good bit of compression and I want it to make it sound snappy, so I don't want it to be too low, but I'm also really not trying to squash them that much yet. I also want a pretty quick release time because I want this thing to work with the pace of the drums, right? We always want to time the attack and release to the pace of the program material that you're putting it on. In this case, it's pretty quick tempo, so I want it to kind of go back and forth, compressed, release, and then I'm going to set a medium attack time, and I'm going to start dialing in the input volume. I may have to turn it down a bit, I may have to turn it up a bit, but I want to get just 5, 6, 8, maybe even 10 dB worth of gain reduction. What I'm really doing though is I'm listening for how it's reacting. The number's not so important. The sound is what's important. So I'm going to start playing it, and I'm going to play with the input gain and see where it sounds the best to me. Now, right now, mind you, if you look at this, the compressor is set to all the way wet. There is no dry signal included. We can work with that in just a minute, but right now I'm going to get my compressor going the way I want it. Did you hear that? I mean, we're going to A-B this again in a second, but this is really where you can start developing some attitude in your drums, right in the overheads, and then I'll show you in a few minutes, we're going to do something similar with the room mic too, and we're going to choose which one's going to be the aggressor and which one's going to be a little bit more laid back. Sometimes it's the overhead, sometimes it's the room mic, Sometimes I really just love what the overheads are doing and I don't even need the room mics. It depends on the song. So we're gonna keep going through this and we're gonna decide a little bit later exactly the way we want it to work. Before I move on to the room mics, I'm just gonna listen first in bypass. In a couple of bars, I'm gonna put the compressor back in and you're gonna tell the difference. What I want you to listen for is how like all the other quieter sounds seem to get bigger. And it seems like you're hearing the room that the microphones were placed in a little bit more. It just gets more aggressive and more assertive. If we have any gain issues, I'm gonna gain match it while we're at it too, to make sure that we're just listening to just the change of the compression and not a change in loudness. You hear how that really brought the toms out, right? You can start to hear the kit ring a little bit more. To me, that's exciting. That sounds like rock drums to me. We can do a very, very similar sort of thing with a room mic. After all, it's kind of doing the same thing, but just from a different perspective. It's a little further away from the drum kit, and it tends to be a mono microphone in a lot of cases. Sometimes you have stereo room mics too, so you can play with that. But in this case, we just have a mono room mic. I'm gonna add an EQ so that I can take out some of the low end. Feeling pretty good about that as a starting point for my room mic. I'm also gonna do almost the same operation here, and as a matter of fact, I'm gonna use the same compressor, but this time I'm gonna squeeze the crap out of it. Same operation with this kind of compressor. I don't want my detector circuit squashing anything on the low end, although I took most of that out, so it's probably not gonna be an issue. I know I'm gonna leave this one on fully wet, all the compression I can get out of it. I'm gonna choose about the similar ratio, 4:1, 6:1, somewhere in that range. A medium attack time and a relatively fast release time because I want this thing to just move with the sound. And this time, I'm not gonna be shy about the input gain. I'm gonna start cranking that sucker up until it's really moving. Check it out. That thing is really compressing. I cranked the input gain almost all the way up, and I made the attack time a little bit faster. I don't necessarily want to hear as much of the, the transits at the beginning of these beats. What I want to hear is I want to hear the wash. I want to hear the wash of the drum sort of reverberating in the room. Once I get this far, what I like to do is pull that room mic all the way down and then start listening to my overheads, and I'm gonna try to sneak that room mic up underneath it. And what I want it to do is just reinforce and support sort of the washy nature of these drums. So you see how really smashing that room mic can help you get some like gritty quality to the sound just underneath those overheads. You still have like that nice sound of the overheads. At this point though, I really like how much the room mic is compressing, and I think that the overheads might be compressing a little bit too much. I'm gonna go ahead and back off that mix control on the overhead. So I'm gonna put a little bit more dry signal into it while listening to both the overheads and the room mics and see if I can get a blend between the openness of the less compressed sound and the grittiness of that really compressed room mic. Because I'm an audio nerd, I can't wait to show you what it's gonna sound like when you get like a really solid kick drum under that. So we're gonna go ahead and put that in anyway. Why? Because I can't help myself. It's just what we do. This kick drum is unprocessed as well. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna really quickly get a little compression on that, maybe a little bit of EQ, and I just want to control the dynamics a little bit. We're not going to go too much into how I might process this stuff. I just got to have it in there. Most of the time on a kick drum, I'm going to put that detector up, around 150 or so. I'm going to get a pretty quick release time. This is almost like what we were doing with the other drums, but we'll treat it just a little bit differently. I want a little bit longer attack time. I really want that transient on the kick to come through, and I want the compressor to hold on to it just for half a second until the next beat comes in. And about a 4-to-1 ratio, something like that. So let's just listen to that kick drum by itself in isolation for a second and just get it tightened up a little bit so we can hear how it sounds underneath it. I think this is important because I want you to know how the close mic stuff relates to what we did on the overheads and the room mic. I don't want to leave you hanging. For our purposes for right now, we're going to stop there. Trust me, you'll be sitting here for 3 hours while I mix the drums because I just get crazy like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull that kick drum down. We're going to go back to listening to our overheads and our room mic, and I'm just going to sneak that solid kick right up underneath it. Let's do one more fun thing. Why not? We have it. It's a cool thing. Oh, let's say I'm going to go with the overhead microphone and I'm going to add a little bit of room reverb to it because I want to put this in a more natural space. I want to make it sound like I recorded it in a slightly larger room than I did. So this is really cool for that kind of stuff. We're going to take this TSAR-1 Reverb. I want it to be in a small room, high diffusion, and I'm going to make it a pretty short reverb, around 500 milliseconds or so. Cut a little bit of the brightness. I don't want any pre-delay. On drums with pre-delay, it starts to sound like it's slap back or something like that. I generally never use a pre-delay on a drum kit. That's not to say never. You never know what's going to work, so try everything, have fun, experiment. But this is where I'm going to start. So I'm going to put it all the way on the dry setting, start playing the drums back, and just add enough of this so that the overheads sound like they're in a little bit bigger space. I want it to expand a little bit. Check it out. That sounded pretty cool. It sounded pretty rock and roll. I mean, of course, you want to hear this in context with the rest of the instruments, but in my experience, like a nice roomy drum sound like that for big rock songs is kind of what you want. While I was adjusting that, I adjusted a couple of volumes, but I also went back to the EQ that's on the overheads, and I added a little bit of 150 hertz. Why? Because I heard those toms are rocking, and I wanted them just to be a bit meatier. That's all. So the last thing that I'm going to do, just a real quick thing, is I'm going to go ahead and put a grand channel on the drum bus. Now this drum bus is all of the drums, including the overheads and the kick drum and the room mic, all bust together onto one auxiliary. And I'm going to go ahead and just put a grand channel on there. And I don't want to use the compressor, so I'm going to turn that off. I'm just going to use the EQ, and I'm going to play with the curve of the drum kit as a whole. So I'm treating it kind of like a stem, right? I'm going to put the filter on and cut everything below 47 hertz, just all that flubby stuff that I really don't need. And I think I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of high-end sparkle in there somewhere. But I don't want too much high-frequency stuff in there. I don't want the drums rising above the other elements in the mix that are going to be sort of bright and airy up top. So I don't want to go too far there. So I'm actually going to set the low pass at 12K for right now. I might go up to 18K. I've got to listen to it before I can tell you for sure. but I'm gonna start adding in maybe a little 10K and just see how it feels. I want these drums to sparkle a little bit more. They're a little bit dull. So I'm gonna set this band at 10 kilohertz. I like to have a pretty wide bandwidth when I'm boosting. It just sounds more natural to me. And being this is a Pultec style EQ, that's actually what it's meant to do. And I'm gonna leave that on the high shelf setting because I kind of want a little bit of push all the way up to 12K, right where I've got my low pass filter set. Let's play it back, and I'm gonna start adding just a little bit of gain, and we'll see how it feels. So one of the things I'm noticing right now is that the cymbals are starting to get a little bit harsh when they're, really pushing into those big hits. I will probably try to remove 8K from the overheads right before they hit the compressor because I just don't want those rocking the compressor that much. Let's play that back real quick and see if that works out. I think that's a pretty cool starting space. Of course, drums, they take a while. I'll typically spend 2 hours, 3 hours, or even 4 hours making sure I get the right drum setup, especially when I'm mixing an entire record for somebody. I want to make sure the drums are consistently good all the way through, so I'll spend a lot of time on them. But this should get you started getting a nice rock and drum sound, something that sounds aggressive, that would go great with some pretty heavy guitars, big bass, and a huge screaming vocal. Give these tips a try. Hopefully they work out in your mix. See you again.